The council chamber floated in the darkness of space, a massive ring of metal and glass that circled the planet Velar Prime. Inside, representatives from dozens of species sat in their designated seats, most of them barely paying attention to the small human standing at the speaker's platform. Taesung wore the simple gray uniform of the human Commonwealth. He carried no weapons, no guards, no signs of importance. To the other species in the room, he looked like what humans had always been: unremarkable, plain, forgettable. He cleared his throat and began to speak. The human Commonwealth hereby announces our withdrawal from all galactic affairs, effective immediately. We are leaving. Thank you for your time. The chamber fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Councillor Vexith of the Velarite Federation began to laugh. His crystalline body chimed like breaking glass as he shook with amusement. Others joined in. The Keshan representative made a clicking sound that translated to mild confusion. The Morphean ambassador didn't even look up from his datapad. Leaving? Vexith said, his voice carrying across the chamber. To where exactly? Back to your little backwater systems? How will you survive without access to our markets, our technology, our protection? Taesung stood quietly, waiting for the laughter to die down. When it finally did, he spoke again. We have made our decision. All human personnel will depart within 72 hours. We wish you well. He turned and walked out. The council chamber buzzed with conversation, but most of it was dismissive. Humans ran the sanitation systems. Humans maintained the lower-level machinery. Humans did the jobs that other species found too boring or too beneath them. What did it matter if they left? On the orbital station above Kes Prime, Dr. G1 made her final rounds through the trauma center. The facility was massive, spanning 3 levels and equipped to handle medical emergencies for over a dozen different species. She had worked here for 8 years, leading a team of 40 human doctors and nurses. Her assistant, a young human named Mincio, followed her with a data pad. The last patient transport left an hour ago, Mincio said. We've transferred all critical cases to the Keshan Medical Facility downtown. G1 nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She looked at the empty beds, the quiet hallways, the equipment that had saved so many lives. The Keshans had asked why she was closing the center. She had tried to explain that all human staff were leaving, that there was no one to run the facility. They had waved her concerns away, saying their own doctors would take over. But G1 knew the truth. This center handled the complicated cases, the ones that required knowledge of multiple species biology. It operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because emergencies didn't follow schedules. The Keshan doctors were excellent with their own kind, but they specialized. They didn't have the broad training, the willingness to work endless hours. The adaptability that humans had developed over centuries. She locked the main doors behind her and uploaded all medical records to the Keshan government servers. Her hand shook slightly as she entered the final access codes, then changed them to prevent anyone from accidentally damaging the expensive equipment inside. Maybe someday the Keshans would find people willing to do this work. Maybe not. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on hundreds of worlds and stations. On Nexus Station, the massive commercial hub that processed trade for the entire Velarite sector, human engineers quietly shut down their workstations and boarded transport ships. They left behind detailed manuals, maintenance schedules, and access to all systems. They had tried to train replacements over the years, but the other species always said they were too busy with more important work. Lieutenant Haiyan Wu stood on the bridge of the transport ship Steady Dawn as it pulled, away from the station where he had lived for 6 years. He had maintained the water recycling systems, the atmospheric processors, the waste management networks that kept 30,000 beings alive in the vacuum of space. It was not glamorous work. Other species had often walked past him without a glance, as if he were part of the machinery itself. But Hyam-Woo took pride in his work. He knew that clean water, breathable air, and proper waste disposal were the foundations of civilization. Without these basics, nothing else mattered. He had hoped that others would see this importance, would treat him and his fellow workers with some respect. Instead, they had been mocked, ignored, paid poorly, and treated as disposable. The final decision to leave had not come from anger, but from exhaustion. Humanity had spent 200 years trying to find its place in galactic society. They had joined with hope, offering their labor and their skills. They had been given the jobs no one else wanted and told to be grateful for the opportunity. When humans tried to move into other fields, they were blocked by regulations, by prejudice, by casual cruelty. So they decided to stop trying. If the galaxy saw them only as janitors and mechanics, as nurses and technicians, then the galaxy could learn to do without them. On the agricultural world of Cas 4, Young-Soo finished his last inspection of the crop fields. He had managed pest control for this region, overseeing a complex system of natural predators, careful timing, and environmental monitoring. The work required constant attention, daily adjustments, and deep knowledge of dozens of interconnected ecosystems. Bekeshan landowners had nodded when he explained he was leaving, barely listening. They assumed the automated systems would continue working. They didn't understand that the automation required a human touch, that someone needed to watch for the small problems before they became big ones. Young-Soo climbed aboard the shuttle that would take him to the transport ship. He looked back at the fields, golden and healthy under the afternoon sun. He wondered how long they would stay that way. The human exodus was orderly and complete. Within 72 hours, every human had left galactic space. They took their families, their belongings, their knowledge, and their labor. They did not sabotage anything. They did not leave angry messages. They simply departed, leaving behind empty quarters and silent workstations. The galaxy barely noticed. News feeds mentioned it in passing, usually in dismissive tones. Some outlets joked about humans finally admitting they didn't belong. Others wondered who would clean the lower decks now, but assumed someone would figure it out. On the bridge of the colony ship, New Dawn, Captain Daehyun watched the stars change as they entered the coordinates for humanity's new home. Behind them, galactic civilization continued as it always had, confident and bright. Ahead lay unknown space, far from the core worlds, where humanity would build something new. Daehyun felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what could have been, for the friendships that might have formed, for the mutual respect that never came. Relief that they were finally free to create a society based on their own values, where every job mattered, where every person had dignity. The galaxy would go on without them. Or so everyone believed. 6 weeks had passed since the humans left. On Nexus Station, Station Manager Kelver was having a terrible day. The water tasted wrong. Not dangerous, according to the sensors, but wrong. Slightly metallic, with a faint chemical smell that made people complain. He called the maintenance department. The water recycling system needs attention. The Velarite technician who answered sounded annoyed. The system shows green across all indicators. There's no problem. But the water tastes bad, Kelver insisted. Then adjust your taste preferences. I'm busy with important work. The call ended. Kelver stared at his communicator in frustration. He remembered there used to be a human engineer who handled water systems. What was his name? Hyan something? The human had stopped by his office once a week with reports that Kelver never read. Now that human was gone, and apparently no one had taken his place. 3 days later, the water stopped flowing entirely. Panic spread through Nexus Station as 30,000 beings realized they had no water for drinking, cooking, or sanitation. Emergency teams rushed to the recycling plant and found a nightmare of flashing red lights and error messages. The systems were incredibly complex. Filters needed changing on precise schedules. Chemical balances required constant adjustment. Pipes needed inspection for wear. Sensors needed calibration. The human engineer had done all of this every single day, making tiny corrections that prevented major failures. The maintenance log showed his work, hundreds of small fixes, adjustments, and preventive measures. But the logs were written in technical language that the emergency teams couldn't fully understand. They tried following the procedures, but they didn't know which tasks were urgent and which could wait. They didn't have the experience to troubleshoot when something went wrong. It took 4 days to get water flowing again, and even then, it wasn't quite right. Similar problems emerged across the galaxy. On Kes 4, the golden crop fields that Young-Soo attended began to show signs of stress. Brown patches appeared in the grain. Insects that should have been controlled by natural predators began to swarm. The Keshan landowners called in agricultural experts, who examined the automated pest control systems and declared them functional. "Everything is working correctly," they said, pointing to the green status lights, but the crops continued to fail. The experts didn't understand that working correctly and working effectively were different things. The automated systems released predator insects on a fixed schedule, but Young-Soo had adjusted that schedule based on weather, temperature, predator population, and dozens of other factors. He had known when to release more predators, when to hold back, when to supplement with other methods. Without his daily oversight, the system followed its basic programming, which wasn't enough. The predator insects were released at the wrong times, in the wrong quantities, in the wrong locations. Pest populations exploded. Crop yields dropped by 40%. On a world that fed billions, this was a disaster. On Morphia Central, the largest hospital in the Morphian Empire, faced a different crisis. Supplies weren't arriving. Operating rooms ran out of surgical tools. Pharmacies couldn't get medications. Emergency rooms lacked basic equipment. The hospital administrator, a proud Morphian named Drexis, demanded answers from the logistics department. "Where are our supplies?" The logistics coordinator looked exhausted. "The system is broken. We send requests, but shipments go to the wrong locations. Or they don't ship at all. Or they arrive damaged. Fix it." "We're trying." But the supply network spans hundreds of worlds. Someone used to coordinate all of this, making sure everything went to the right place at the right time. But that person is gone. Threxis felt a cold sensation in his chest. "You mean the human administrator?" That small female who was always working in the logistics office. Dr. Subin, yes. She ran the entire medical supply network for this sector. We thought it was mostly automated, but she was making thousands of decisions every day. Without her, the automation doesn't know what to do when problems arise. Across the empire, hospitals faced the same crisis. The supply network that Dr. Subin and other human administrators had carefully maintained was collapsing. Medicines expired in warehouses because no one redirected them when delivery routes changed. Equipment sat in loading docks because the automated systems didn't account for station repairs or ship delays. Critical supplies went to small clinics, while major hospitals received routine items. People began to die from treatable conditions because the right supplies weren't available. It was a slow, grinding disaster, one that grew worse each day. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Councillor Vexith stood before his fellow representatives, his crystalline body no longer chiming with laughter. "We need to discuss the infrastructure problems affecting our territories." Other councillors nodded. The Keshan representative spoke of agricultural failures. The Morphian ambassador reported medical supply breakdowns. Representatives from a dozen other species added their own stories of systems failing, services degrading, and population suffering. "These are temporary difficulties," Vexith said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We simply need to reorganize our workforce, train new personnel, and update our procedures." The Keshan representative clicked thoughtfully. "How long will this take?" No one had an answer. The truth, which none of them wanted to admit, was that they didn't actually know how to do the work the humans had done. It had seemed so simple, so menial, so beneath notice. Now they realized it was none of those things. "Perhaps we should contact the humans," someone suggested. "Offer them contracts to return. Better pay, better conditions." Vexith bristled at this. "We will not beg. They were workers, nothing more. We will find others to do their jobs." But finding others proved impossible. The Velorites tried to train their own citizens, but most refused to do what they saw as degrading labor. The Keshans attempted to use their servant class, but these beings lacked the necessary education and training. The Morphians tried conscripting the small Quillan people, but the Quillans died in accidents when forced to operate equipment designed for larger species. The Council drafted a formal request for human assistance. They phrased it carefully, offering trade concessions and improved working conditions. They transmitted it on all known human frequencies, but no response came. The humans had taken their communication networks with them, and no one knew how to reach them. The message disappeared into empty space, unanswered and unacknowledged, on humanity's new colony world. Lothumnu Hyan Wu sat in a comfortable chair, watching the sunset through the window of his small house. He had heard about the message through intelligence channels. The human government had decided not to respond. He understood why. The galaxy hadn't just failed to appreciate human work. They had actively disrespected it, mocked it, treated human workers as less than people. An apology would have meant something 6 weeks ago. Now it was too late. The damage was done, and humanity had moved on. Hyan Wu felt sad rather than satisfied. He had genuinely liked some of the people on Nexus Station. He had hoped they could all work together as equals. But hope wasn't enough when it wasn't returned. He turned away from the sunset and went to help prepare dinner. Tomorrow he would start his new job, helping to build infrastructure for humanity's growing colony. It was the same kind of work he had done before, but here it would be valued. Here, every job mattered equally. Here, he was respected. The galaxy's problems were no longer his concern. 3 months after the humans left, the galaxy was drowning in garbage. On Vila Prime, the capital world of the Velorite Federation, waste disposal had become a crisis. Mountains of trash piled up in designated areas, growing larger each day. The automated collection system still worked, but they kept breaking down in ways no one knew how to fix. When they did work, they often jammed or deposited waste in the wrong processing centers. Counselor Vexith stood on his balcony, looking at the city below. He could see the trash heaps from here, ugly brown stains on the beautiful crystal architecture. The smell reached even this high up, carried on the wind. Citizens were protesting in the streets, demanding action. He had ordered his best engineers to solve the problem. They had examined the waste management systems and found them functional but temperamental. The systems needed constant small adjustments that the engineers didn't know how to make. More frustratingly, the engineers considered this work beneath their status. They wanted to design new buildings, create advanced technology, not fix garbage trucks. "We need workers willing to do this job," Vex's chief engineer had said. "The humans used to do it. We need someone like them." But there was no one like them. Every species in the galaxy had its own culture, its own sense of pride and hierarchy. Most considered manual labor degrading. The few species who might have been willing lacked the training, the education, or the physical capability. Humans had been unique in their combination of intelligence, adaptability, and willingness to do necessary work regardless of prestige. On the mining world of Tarko 7, the situation was even worse. The automated mining equipment had started malfunctioning at an alarming rate. Machines broke down and stayed broken. Ore extraction dropped by 60%. The Velarite company that owned the mines demanded answers. The local supervisor checked the maintenance records and made a disturbing discovery. The mines had never been fully automated. Human overseers had monitored every machine, performing preventive maintenance, making adjustments, and catching problems before they became catastrophic. They had optimized the mining routes, scheduled equipment rotations, and ensured safety protocols were followed. Without them, the machines simply ran until they broke. Then they sat broken because no one knew how to fix them properly. The few technicians who tried often made things worse, lacking the experience and systematic knowledge the humans had possessed. Production continued to fall. Prices for raw materials began to rise across the galaxy. In Keshen space, an even stranger problem emerged. The Keshen Hive Collective was fragmenting. The hive structure had always been complex, with hundreds of sub-hives, each speaking a slightly different dialect, each following slightly different customs. For decades, humans had served as translators and mediators between these groups. The humans hadn't just translated words. They had understood context, cultural nuance, and historical grievances. When sub-hives disagreed, human mediators had helped them find common ground. When communication broke down, humans had patiently rebuilt it. Now those mediators were gone. Sub-hives began to misunderstand each other. Small disagreements escalated into serious conflicts. Trade between hives became difficult, then impossible. Some sub-hives stopped communicating entirely, retreating into isolation. The Keshen government tried to create translation programs and train their own mediators, but it didn't work. The programs were too literal, missing subtle meanings. The Keshen mediators took sides, unable to remain neutral like the humans had been. The collective, which had been unified for centuries, began to crack apart. On Morpheus Central, Dr. Threxis walked through his hospital, counting empty beds. They'd had to close 2 entire wings due to lack of supplies and staff. The medical supply crisis had only gotten worse. Now they faced a new problem. They didn't have enough medical workers. It turned out that humans hadn't just run the trauma center that Dr. G1 had closed. They had worked in hospitals across the Empire, filling gaps that Morphean doctors refused to fill. Humans had worked night shifts, weekend shifts, and holidays. They had taken on the difficult cases, the emergency situations, the time-consuming treatments that require patience rather than brilliance. Morphean doctors were skilled, but they specialized narrowly and worked limited hours. They considered it beneath them to work constantly or to treat conditions outside their specialty. The hospital system had relied on human doctors and nurses to handle everything else. Now, those positions sat empty. Morphean medical schools couldn't produce enough graduates to fill them, and the graduates they did produce weren't interested in general practice or emergency medicine. They wanted prestigious positions in research or specialized surgery. Patients with common illnesses waited weeks for appointments. Emergency rooms overflowed. People died waiting for care that would have been routine 3 months ago. Across the galaxy, the pattern repeated. Environmental systems failed on stations because no one maintained them properly. Food distribution networks collapsed because no one coordinated the complex logistics. Power grids became unstable because no one monitored them closely enough. These weren't dramatic failures. No stations exploded. No planets burned. Instead, life simply became harder, more dangerous, more uncertain. Things that had always worked now worked poorly or not at all. Services that had been reliable became unreliable. Systems that had been stable became fragile. On the agricultural station Greenworld 7, Engineer Daehyun's absence was felt acutely. He had maintained the power grid for 70 inhabited systems, making sure electricity flowed constantly to millions of homes, farms, and businesses. The grid was old, complex, and temperamental. It required someone who understood its quirks, who could sense problems before they appeared on monitors, who knew exactly which switches to flip and which to leave alone. The Vulrites who tried to maintain the grid after Daehyun left had technical training but no experience. They followed procedures but didn't understand why those procedures existed. When unusual situations arose, they made logical choices that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Power outages became common. Some lasted minutes, others hours, a few lasted days. Crops spoiled in storage. Medical equipment shut down. Environmental systems failed. People suffered and sometimes died because electricity wasn't there when they needed it. The Morphean Empire, growing desperate, attempted a solution. They conscripted the Quillan people, a small species that had always served as laborers for the Morpheans. Surely the Quillans could do the simple work that humans had done. It was a disaster. The Quillans had been servants, not skilled workers. They lacked education, training, and often the physical size to operate equipment designed for larger species. Forced into dangerous jobs without proper preparation, thousands of Quillans died in industrial accidents within weeks. The Quillan communities, which had always been meek and submissive, began to resist. They refused dangerous assignments. They sabotaged equipment rather than use it unsafely. Some fled into remote areas where the Morpheans couldn't find them. The Morphean government responded with force, which only made things worse. They faced a population that was small and weak but numerous and desperate. The Empire had to divert resources from fixing their infrastructure problems to controlling the Quillan uprising. The Galactic Council met again, this time in emergency session. The mood was grim. Every representative had a list of problems longer than the last meeting. Every solution they had tried had failed or made things worse. "We need the humans back," the Morphean ambassador said flatly. "We cannot maintain our civilization without them." Vexith wanted to argue, but he couldn't. His pride had kept him from admitting the truth for months, but the truth was undeniable now. The humans hadn't been doing simple work. They had been doing essential work that required intelligence, skill, dedication, and adaptability. Work that other species either couldn't or wouldn't do. "They won't come back," the Keshan representative clicked. "We sent messages. We offered better terms. They ignore us. Then we offer more," someone suggested. "Full citizenship rights. Equal status. Whatever they want." The council drafted a new message, this one acknowledging their mistakes and offering significant concessions. They admitted that they had undervalued human contributions. They promised equal treatment and respect. The message was transmitted on every frequency, broadcast to every corner of known space. Again, silence. The humans had moved beyond the range of normal communications, and they had no interest in coming back. On the human colony world Haven's Rest, Dr. Su Bin read the intelligence reports about the medical crisis in the Morphean Empire. She felt sympathy for the patients suffering, but she felt no obligation to return and help. She had spent years trying to make the system work better, trying to get the Morpheans to train more general practitioners, trying to explain that healthcare needed more than just brilliant specialists. They had ignored her. They had treated her as a useful tool, but never as an equal colleague. Her suggestions had been dismissed, her concerns overlooked, her work taken for granted. Now she worked in a small hospital on Haven's Rest, treating human patients and enjoying the novel experience of being respected. Her colleagues asked her opinion. Her suggestions were implemented. Her work was valued. The galaxy's problems were no longer her responsibility. 6 months after humanity's departure, Council of Vexith stood in what used to be his beautiful city and saw only ruins. Not the dramatic ruins of war or disaster, but something worse, the slow decay of neglect. Buildings still stood, but their environmental systems failed regularly. Streets were clean in some areas and filthy in others. Power came and went unpredictably. Water quality varied from block to block. His people were leaving Velar Prime. Those who could afford it moved to better maintained areas. Those who couldn't rioted in the streets, demanding that their government fix the problems. But the government couldn't fix problems they didn't understand. Vexith finally admitted the truth to himself. Humans hadn't just done menial work. They had been the foundation that held everything together. They had filled the gaps between species who were too specialized, too proud, or too focused on prestigious work to maintain basic infrastructure. They had done the boring, repetitive, essential tasks that kept civilization running, and the galaxy had mocked them for it. News reports from across civilized space painted a similar picture. On the trade hub Nexus Station, population had dropped from 30,000 to 8,000. People fled as systems continued to fail. The station that had once been the economic heart of the sector was becoming a ghost town. On Kes 4, the agricultural crisis had grown into a famine. Crop yields had fallen so low that the planet couldn't feed its own population, much less export to other worlds. The Keshan government tried importing food, but the logistics networks that used to distribute supplies had collapsed. Food rotted in spaceports while people starved in cities. Investigation teams tried to understand what had gone wrong. They found that humans had been everywhere in the supply chain. Human workers had loaded cargo. Human administrators had scheduled shipments. Human inspectors had verified quality. Human coordinators had rerouted supplies when problems arose. The system had looked automated, but humans had been the ones making it actually work. Without them, automation did exactly what it was programmed to do, which often made no sense. Ships delivered winter clothing to tropical zones. Medical supplies went to worlds that had ordered mining equipment. Food shipments sat waiting for authorization that never came because the authorization system had been managed by a human clerk who's now gone. The Keshan Hive Collective faced complete breakdown. Sub-hives that had cooperated for centuries now refused to communicate. Ancient grievances, once mediated by patient human negotiators, flared into open conflict. Some sub-hives declared independence. Others formed new alliances that excluded traditional partners. The Keshan government tried to restore unity, but lacked the tools. They had relied on humans to be neutral third parties, to speak all the dialects, to understand all the cultural nuances. Without humans, they discovered the Keshans couldn't even agree on what the problems were, much less how to solve them. In the Morphean Empire, the situation had become catastrophic. The medical system had collapsed. Hospitals operated at a fraction of their capacity. The medical supply network was completely broken. Doctors refused to work the hours needed to handle the patient load. People died from treatable conditions in hallways while specialized equipment sat unused because no one knew how to operate it. Dr. Phrexus had aged 10 years and 6 months. He spent his days making impossible choices about who would receive care and who would be turned away. The trauma center that Dr. G1 had run remained closed. No one had the combination of skills and dedication needed to operate it. The building sat empty, full of expensive equipment that no one knew how to use. The Morphean government's attempt to use Quillan labor had exploded into a full crisis. The Quillans, pushed too far, had organized a rebellion. Small groups attacked Morphean facilities, sabotaged equipment, and fled into wilderness areas. The Empire had to deploy military forces to restore order. But this only created more resentment and more resistance. Worse, Other servant species watched the Quillen uprising and began to question their own positions. If the mighty Morphean Empire was struggling this badly, maybe the traditional hierarchy wasn't as natural or inevitable. As everyone had always claimed, environmental disasters multiplied across the galaxy. On terraformed worlds, the careful balance of ecosystems began to fail. Humans had monitored these systems, making tiny adjustments that prevented cascading failures. Without that monitoring, small problems became large ones. On the planet Velos 2, oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to drop. The terraforming plants that generated breathable air were dying because the soil chemistry was wrong. The soil chemistry was wrong because the automated systems didn't account for seasonal variations. Those variations had been managed by a human environmental engineer named Kyung-soo, who had adjusted fertilizer schedules and water distribution based on real-time observations. Now Kyung-soo was gone, and no one else had his detailed knowledge of Velos 2's specific conditions. The planetary government hired expensive consulting firms, who examined the terraforming systems and recommended complex solutions. But the solutions didn't work because the consultants didn't understand the subtle, planet-specific factors that Kyung-soo had learned through years of hands-on experience. Velos 2 began evacuating its population. A world that had been home to millions was being abandoned because no one could keep the air breatable. Similar evacuations happened across the galaxy. Stations became uninhabitable. Colony worlds lost critical systems. Mining outposts shut down. The boundaries of civilized space actually shrank as people retreated from places they couldn't maintain. The death toll was staggering. Initial estimates put it at 200 million across the galaxy, and the number kept rising. Most died from indirect causes: medical care failures, supply disruptions, environmental system breakdowns. These weren't dramatic deaths. They were quiet tragedies. People who died because something that should have worked, DIDN, Young-G, stood in her garden on Haven's Rest, watching her daughter play. The child was only 3 years old, too young to remember the life they had left behind. She would grow up in a society that valued all work equally, where maintaining systems was just as respected as designing them, where being a good farmer mattered as much as being a brilliant scientist. Reports from the galaxy reached Haven's Rest regularly. Young-G read them with mixed feelings. Part of her felt vindicated. Humanity had tried to explain that their work was important, that treating them poorly would have consequences. No one had listened. Now the consequences were clear, but another part of her just felt sad. So many people were suffering. So many were dying. It didn't have to be this way. If the galaxy had just treated humans with basic respect, if they had listened when humans tried to explain the importance of their work, if they had been willing to see humans as equals rather than servants, none of this would have happened. The Galactic Council met for what many expected to be their final session. The various alliances and federations were fragmenting. With infrastructure failing and resources scarce, cooperation was breaking down. Species blamed each other for the crisis. Old rivalries resurfaced. New conflicts emerged. "We are facing the collapse of our civilization," the Keshan representative said bluntly. "Not from war or plague, but from simple inability to maintain what we have built." The Morphean ambassador, a different person than 6 months ago since the previous ambassador had resigned in disgrace, spoke quietly. "We have no solutions. Every attempt to fill the roles humans played has failed. We cannot train our people fast enough, and most refuse to do this work anyway. Our culture values prestige over necessity. This has destroyed us." Vexus stood to speak, his crystalline body dull and scratched from months of stress. "I move that we formally acknowledge our mistakes. We undervalued humanity's contributions. We treated them with disrespect and contempt. We deserve what has happened to us. The motion passed unanimously. It was perhaps the first thing the council had agreed on in months. They drafted a new message to humanity. This one was different from previous attempts. It wasn't an offer or a negotiation. It was a simple apology and acknowledgement. They admitted they had been wrong. They stated clearly that humans had been the foundation of galactic civilization and that they should have been treated as equals from the beginning. They didn't ask humans to return. They didn't offer anything in exchange. They simply apologized and took responsibility for their failures. The message was sent, broadcast across every frequency, transmitted to every corner of space where humans might be listening. This time, after 6 months of silence, humanity finally responded. 1 year after humanity's departure, elder diplomat Ji-hoon appeared on every screen in the galaxy. He was an older human, his hair white, his face lined with years of experience. He wore simple clothing and stood in a plain room. There was no attempt at intimidation or grandeur. He looked like what he was, a tired man delivering an important message. "We have received your apology," Ji-hoon said, his voice calm and measured. "We appreciate the honesty and the acknowledgement of past mistakes. We understand that your civilizations are struggling. We know that many are suffering and dying." He paused, letting those words hang in the air. "Humanity will not return to the old arrangement. We will not go back to being invisible workers in a society that treats us as lesser beings. We have built a new home, a new society where every person's contribution is valued equally, where maintenance workers are respected as much as scientists, where the person who keeps the water flowing is honored alongside the person who designs the ships." Across the galaxy, beings watched and listened, some with hope, some with despair, some with anger. "However," Ji-hoon continued, "we are willing to help. Not as employees, not as servants, but as teachers and partners. We will send volunteers to your worlds to train your people in the skills needed to maintain your civilizations. We will share our knowledge freely, but we will only work with societies that treat us, and all workers, with respect and dignity." He outlined the terms. Human volunteers would come in small teams. They would teach, not do the work themselves. They would stay only as long as needed to train capable replacements. They would be treated as honored guests, paid fairly, and given the same status as any other professional. "The choice is yours," Ji-hoon said. "Learn to value the work that keeps your societies functioning or continue to decline. We hope you choose wisely." The transmission ended. The galaxy erupted in debate. Some species accepted immediately. The Keshan Hive Collective, facing complete fragmentation, was among the first to agree to humanity's terms. They were desperate for the mediators and translators who could help restore communication between sub-hives. The first human volunteers arrived on Kes Prime 3 weeks later. They were treated like visiting dignitaries, which felt strange to them at first. But they adapted and began their work. They taught young Keshans how to translate not just words but meaning, how to understand cultural context, how to mediate disputes fairly, how to bridge differences between groups with different perspectives. It was slow work. The volunteers made it clear that there were no shortcuts. Learning these skills required time, patience, and dedication. Some Keshan students dropped out, finding the work too tedious or beneath their status. But others persisted, recognizing that this knowledge was essential for their society's survival. On Morpheus Central, Dr. Threxus personally welcomed the human medical volunteers. He had requested them specifically, hoping to reopen the trauma center that Dr. Ji-won had closed. The volunteers agreed to help but set clear conditions. "We will teach you how to run a multi-species trauma center," the lead volunteer, a doctor named Bora, explained. "But you need to understand what that requires. It means working irregular hours. It means learning to treat conditions outside your specialty. It means putting patients' needs ahead of your own prestige. Are you willing to do this? Some Morphean doctors walked away. They couldn't accept work they saw as beneath them, even with their empire collapsing around them. But others stayed. Younger doctors, mostly, who saw the crisis clearly and wanted to help. They studied under the human volunteers, learning not just medical techniques, but also the dedication and work ethic required to keep a trauma center running. The Velarite Federation, however, refused humanity's offer. Counselor Vexith argued that accepting would be admitting permanent inferiority. "We are Velarites," he declared. "We will solve our problems ourselves. We do not need human charity." His pride cost his people dearly. While other species began to recover with human help, the Velarite Federation continued to decline. Infrastructure kept failing. People kept leaving. The economy kept shrinking. But Vexith refused to bend, refused to admit that his species needed help. A year later, with Velar Prime half empty and in ruins, Vexith was removed from power by his own people. The new government immediately accepted humanity's offer. By then, much damage had been done. Recovery would take decades instead of years. On Nexus Station, now operating at only 20% capacity, Velarite engineers worked alongside human volunteers to rebuild the water recycling systems. The chief engineer, once too proud to even speak to human workers, now listened carefully as a volunteer named Taman explained the intricacies of the system. "It's not just about following procedures," Taman said, showing the engineer a series of sensors. "You have to develop a feel for the system. Notice small changes before they become big problems. Understand why the procedures exist, so you know when to bend them and when to follow them strictly." The engineer found the work challenging and, surprisingly, rewarding. He had always designed new systems, but never maintained existing ones. He discovered that keeping something running smoothly required a different kind of intelligence than designing it in the first place. Both were valuable. Both required skill. The Quillan people, still fighting their rebellion against the Morphean Empire, received an unexpected offer. Human volunteers came to Quillan territories and offered to teach them the skills they needed to maintain their own infrastructure. Not to serve the Morpheans, but to build their own independent society. The Quillans accepted eagerly. For the first time in their history, they learned to be more than servants. They learned engineering, medicine, agriculture, and logistics. The humans treated them as equals, as capable students who just needed training and opportunity. Within 2 years, the Quillan rebellion transformed into something new, an independence movement with the skills to build their own civilization. The Morphean Empire, weakened and desperate, eventually negotiated a peace that granted the Quillans autonomy. It was a change that would have seemed impossible before humanity left. On Haven's Rest, Young Ji's daughter was now 5 years old. The child asked her mother about the old times, about the galaxy they had left behind. "Why did we leave, Mama?" She asked. Young-G thought carefully about her answer. "Because the people there didn't respect the work we did. They thought it was unimportant because it wasn't fancy or exciting. But all work is important if it helps people." "Are they better now?" "Some are learning," Young-Ji said. "Some are teaching their children to value every kind of work. Others still don't understand. But it's not our job to save them. We can teach them if they want to learn, but they have to choose to change." Across the galaxy, a new generation was growing up with different values. Children who had watched their civilizations nearly collapse learned that maintaining systems was just as important as designing them. That the people who kept water flowing and food arriving deserved the same respect as those who built starships and discovered new physics. Some societies embraced this lesson. They restructured their education systems to honor all types of work. They eliminated the hierarchy that placed prestige above necessity. They built new cultures where a maintenance engineer was valued as much as a research scientist. Other societies resisted. They clung to old prejudices, old hierarchies, old ideas about which work mattered and which didn't. These societies continued to struggle, their infrastructure constantly failing, their populations leaving for better maintained worlds. The galaxy had fractured into different philosophical camps. Some worlds accepted human volunteers and learned from them. These places slowly recovered, building more stable and equitable societies. Other worlds refused help and tried to restore their old ways. These places remained in crisis, trapped by pride and prejudice. Captain Dehayan, now an administrator on Haven's Rest, reviewed reports from the volunteers working across the galaxy. The success rate was encouraging, but not universal. Some students learned well and carried forward what they were taught. Others learned the skills but not the underlying values, treating the work as temporary necessity rather than permanent virtue. "We can teach them how," Dehayan said to his colleague, "but we can't make them care. They have to choose to see value in the work itself, not just see it as a means to an end." His colleague nodded. "Some will learn. Some won't. That's not our responsibility. We offered help. What they do with it is up to them." 5 years after humanity's departure, the galaxy had stabilized at a new normal. It was not the prosperous, unified civilization it had been before. It was smaller, more fragmented, more humble, but perhaps more honest. The species that had learned from humanity's lesson built societies with greater respect for all types of work. They were more stable, more resilient, more fair. The species that had rejected the lesson remained proud but diminished. Their civilizations maintained at a basic level, but never flourishing. Humanity remained in their own space, building their own civilization. They traded with the galaxy, shared knowledge with those who asked respectfully, and sent volunteers to teach where they were welcomed. But they never returned to their old role. They had learned that being essential didn't mean accepting disrespect.